Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So recently Mrs. Van Oaks and I went to Disneyland, and while we were waiting in line for a ride, this Candlestick telephone prop caught my eye. Now she suggested that it might be a fun exercise to see if I could cobble together a prop just using the things that I had laying around the shop. So in this video, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So let's get to it. After looking high and low and in cabinets and drawers that hadn't been opened in years, I came up with the following parts to help make this prop. Some you'll recognize, like the various types and sizes of pipe, and some will be a bit less familiar, like the red and green floodlight covers. But I think this should get me most of the way, and anything else I'll just figure out as I go. The first thing I'll tackle is the base, and for this I found some 1/4-inch MDF rounds that were offcuts from another project. I glued them together and then added a small piece from a 4-inch ABS pipe with a bit of CA glue to give it some height. Then I'll use this outdoor floodlight gel to give it a similar shape to the one we saw at Disneyland. The next section to tackle is the neck. This was the piece that helped to determine the scale of the prop, since it seemed to be the closest to what an actual candlestick phone might be. I added a 6mm round of EVA foam to the end of the pipe as a way to soften the transition from the base to the neck, which would also give me a wider mounting point and a more stable connection between the two parts. So not only is it decorative, but it also serves a purpose. I did my best to eyeball the placement, but it's just slightly off of center. So I considered what side would look best when it was finished and made a mental note of what should be the front face for when I got to adding more parts to the build. With the lower neck section out of the way, I shifted to adding some 3mm EVA foam to the inside of the PVC pipe with a bit of CA glue. And when it was in place, I could wedge a smaller piece of pipe and another 6mm foam ring to give it a more finished edge. While I wait for that to dry, I'm going to move on to the transmitter, or the part that you'd speak into. For this part, I have a smaller diameter of ABS pipe, another MDF cutoff, and a plastic funnel, which will act as the cone part of the transmitter. But before I can glue it all together, I'll need to trim down the pointed end of the funnel. Now I can add a bit of CA glue along the edge of the MDF, and we'll seat the funnel into it and make sure that it's level. Then I can glue the MDF and the funnel to the ABS pipe and give it a minute to bond together. Once the glue is set up, I'll backfill with glue from the inside of the transmitter just to make sure that the funnel doesn't go anywhere, and then I can add the back. This gel is the same size as the previous one, but I trimmed it down a bit before gluing it onto the pipe. It still needs a bit more trimming, so let's get to the sander. I'm sure this could have been done a better way, but I like the idea of sneaking up on my cut lines, and this small bench sander does a great job of getting rid of the excess material and getting it down to its final size. Next up is the receiver. For this I thought that I'd try using the neck from an old bottle of acrylic pouring medium that had an almost Art Deco look to it. So I removed the cap and the body from the bottle and added a bit more PVC and 6mm foam to give it a similar shape to the hand receiver on the phone. I also added a smaller funnel to fill the void inside and give it a finished look. The last part of the body is where the receiver sits in between calls. I cut this small piece of ABS pipe, removed a section to create the U-shape, and rounded over the cut ends for the first piece. Then I grabbed this old mechanical pencil and cut off a section to complete the look of the receiver hook. Then I could screw it in to the side of the neck. A quick test fit with the receiver, and then I can move on to paint. I had this red primer that needed to get used, so that's what I base coated all of the pieces with. And once everything had dried, I switched over to a matte black spray paint and repeated the process, making sure to get good coverage. Now this next part was a bit of rule bending. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't come up with how to create this hinge based on the scraps that I had laying around. I also thought it would be a nice way to add some contrast to the build, so I quickly 3D modeled the part and printed it up in gold filament, which will look great paired with the black phone body. But before I can glue this to the transmitter, I'll need to scratch up the painted surface to make sure I get good adhesion. Then I can add a drop of CA glue and place the hinge onto the back of the transmitter. While the glue dries, I'll prep the neck in the same way, and then I can glue all of the pieces together. Since there's actual hardware on the hinge, I can adjust it to get the right profile, and then I can tighten everything up. After seeing how good the gold filament looked and coming to terms with not liking the receiver that I made from the plastic bottle, I cheated again and 3D printed myself a new one that had a better profile. I also found a vintage fabric-covered power cord from an old radio and glued it into the receiver as well as into a small hole that I drilled on the back of the phone base. The last thing I wanted to do was add something real to the build, so I sawed the heads off of some old screws and glued them in place onto the transmitter. This little touch grounds the prop in reality and helps to blur the lines between a real object and a fake one. In fact, I may go back and add more just to give it a bit more detail. But for now, I'm going to call this one done. Now, considering I didn't have to buy anything new for this build, I'm going to count this as a win, but with an asterisk next to it because of the 3D printing part. Of course, having access to the tools I have in the shop definitely made this process easier, but there's nothing in this build that you couldn't do with the tools you may already have. So don't let that stop you from building this prop or anything else that you can come up with. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.